Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 678, and it is titled E. Haldeman Julius, The Man and His Work, written by John W. Gunn. This is part 5 of the book. This book is about the man who actually produced and edited and everything. Little Blue Books would not be around if it wasn't for this man. So this is the story of him. And we're on part 5, as I said, and we'll start there at I do believe it is the top of page 44. And we'll have to backtrack here a bit for a sentence or two. The whole scheme of life, and to wrest the control of life from the tyranny of old, false, suppressive ideas. One of these occasions, one of the most brilliant and stupendous, was in the 18th century, in the half-century before the French Revolution, when Diderot was the encyclopedist, seizing the many-edged weapon of knowledge, put to flight the bigots and charlatans of an infinitely corrupt and hard and narrow orthodoxy. When, on a recent visit to Gerard, I found Haldeman Julius in his library one evening reading John Morley's account of Diderot and the encyclopedists, he was impressed by certain points of analogy and contrast, and by the similarity of the general idea that inspired Diderot. With his own thought and purpose in publishing the Little Blue Books, he talked at length of Diderot and his work. The tremendous figure of Diderot stands by the side of Voltaire in the 18th century. Someone has remarked that the 18th century was one of peculiar fascination, as it gave full scope to the best as well as the worst, the strongest as well as the weakest, impulses of human nature. Surely the best and the strongest found a worthy representative in Diderot. Diderot is an ideal example of the thinker in whom thought is alive, of the scholar who draws his chief inspiration from life, and who relates his activities to the needs of men. Diderot's ample nature, his powerful and restless intellect, touched life at all points. He was richly endowed with thought, emotion, and indomitable constructive will. He thought and felt deeply and boldly and generously. He had an infinite and dauntless curiosity about life, and he turned his thought and feeling into the most effective channels. Diderot bravely but quietly and undramatically gave up a comfortable position in life in order to live laborious days and impoverished days as a scholar and seeker after wisdom in humble lodgings in Paris. As Diderot stood on the threshold of his life task, his monumental 20 years' labor on the encyclopedia, nothing could have appeared more hopeless to the ordinary observer than that very task. The Church, although it had been shaken by schisms and frightened by a threatened decline of its power, seemed at that moment to be more strongly entrenched than for a number of years. It exercised a stern domination over the thoughts of men, and stood apparently as a solid wall against all efforts toward the liberation and advancement of humanity. The Church, which for a long period had been the custodian of culture, the organizer and director of social life, had proved false to its trust, and was now not merely a force of obscurantism, but a tyrant that clamped an iron hand upon the whole of life. The authority of the Church had not gone unchallenged. Its doctrines had been disputed from time to time, but in a partial and ineffective way. This challenge to the Church had been not only the work of lone antagonists, but it had been purely intellectual, and it had lacked the unity and driving force of a broad viewpoint of life. It was not really so much of a challenge to the Church as an individual breaking away from the Church, and that not always a complete breaking away, but more often a denial of this or that point of theology. There has never been an age when there have not been a number of curious minds who were driven to speculate freely on the great questions of life and its origin, death and its nature, truth and its signs and portents. No rule of church or state, however wide and powerful, has ever been able to wholly subdue the impulse of philosophy. But the philosopher alone in his study is not a social force, and the Church had, before the time of Deirdre, been able to suppress or remove isolated objectors, and certainly it had held its power unbroken and held firmly the social reins. A man of Deirdre's intelligence could not, of course, submit tamely to the dead hand of the Church. He was bound to come into conflict with its obstructionism, this oppression. Observe that no man, Deirdre or who else, could in that day engage in the honest pursuit of knowledge without finding in the Church an inevitable enemy, and a pursuant resourceful, malicious enemy. Deirdre was for a time a controversialist, and little more in his attitude an able controversialist, a good, single-handed skeptic and doubter, but not a man of broad constructive purpose. He presented the liberal philosophy of English thinkers to French readers. He translated Shaftesbury's inquiry concerning merit and virtue under the title of Principles of Moral Philosophy, and under the impulses of Shaftesbury's reflections, he came forward with a volume of his own, Philosophical Thoughts. But it is not Deirdre's early controversies, his individual free thinking, that interest me. He did not stop there. He went on to the supreme and mighty work of his life, the Encyclopedia. He challenged the authority of the Church in every field of social life, and not merely through direct polemics, but through the organization and dissemination of a knowledge of life that would make the position of the Church untenable. He knew that the power of the Church rested upon ignorance. It was his aim to destroy that ignorance by displacing it with knowledge. He had a definite theory of life, a theory of active import that stood squarely opposed to the passive obstructive theory of the Church. The Church had imposed upon men not only a view of life that was fixed and narrow, but one that was hopeless and denied the possibility of a free and gracious life. Human nature was inherently evil. This world was a vale of tears, and its many evils must be patiently borne with the pious gaze on the dim hereafter. Such was the attitude of the Church. This dark and dismal view Deirdre assailed, and the Encyclopedia aided powerfully to dispel. Deirdre believed in the great possibilities of life, and he enforced this viewpoint of hope by showing the wonderful things life then actually held. The Encyclopedia covered all of life, not only the sciences and arts and trades, social and political and religious theory, but the practical details of social activity. I did the best picture of all. I think the best picture of all, as showing Deirdre's infinite and patient work, is that of him going about to this and that workshop, observing how the artisans did their work, putting all sorts of questions, and even having a loom taken apart and rebuilt so they could understand every detail of its mechanism. As Morley says, Deirdre wished to give so exact and complete a description of the arts and sciences that if a deluge should sweep away all these things and only a single copy of the Encyclopedia should be left, it would be possible to reconstruct the machinery of life from its pages. One of the features that distinguished the Encyclopedia was its collection of distinctive plates, which, to quote Morley, strikes the readers as a splendid panorama of all the busy life of time.